Welcome and thank you for joining today's discussion, Amateur Hour, Professional Character in the Question of Leadership, which is also the title of our guest, Dr. Lara Brown's latest book. This event is presented by the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs and the CU Boulder Center for Leadership. This session is being recorded and will be available to watch after the event on the CWA YouTube channel. You can submit questions at any time during the Zoom through the Q&A feature. We invite you to share whether you're a CU student, in addition to the location from which you're joining us. To kick things off, Dr. Brown, you and I know each other, but could you just give us a couple-minute snapshot of the path that has brought you to this moment?
Absolutely. Thank you, President Kennedy. It's a delight to be here this afternoon. I really appreciate the invitation to speak about my book. So as you mentioned, I am Dr. Lara Brown, and I serve as the director of the Graduate School of Political Management at the George Washington University. I have sort of a long path in academia and politics. I did do a time of service in President Clinton's administration in the late 90s. I did my undergraduate and doctorate at UCLA, and prior to being at George Washington, I was serving as an assistant professor at Villanova. So I have been kind of on both coasts, been engaged in the political world and spent much of my academic and scholarly life understanding presidents, political parties, national elections, and I actually wrote my dissertation on scandal among incumbents in the House of Representatives. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about character and leadership, and that's how we arrived where we are today.
Great. And to kick things off, was there a specific figure or event that served as a catalyst for writing this book? And how did you decide upon the comparative structure you used throughout?
Sure. So I would be lying if I said it wasn't Trump. It was Trump. And what I mean by Trump being the impetus for the book is that I stood back and I just said to myself, how is it that sort of a well-known celebrity real estate mogul with a pretty scandalous personal background and a shady business history was seen as someone who had the requisite character to fill the role of President of the United States? That just seemed like such a far cry from what we thought about in terms of who our president should be in the abstract. And really even in the concrete when we look to past presidents like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So it is the case that I kept asking myself, how can a very large minority of the American people see this person as being, legitimate and perfectly sufficient to fill the office of President of the United States?
Many questions we face in politics, that's certainly one. The full title of your book is Amateur Hour, Presidential Character and the Question of Leadership. I'd like to unpack, what do you mean by character? Character has many meanings and much depends on context, and over the course of American history, how it's used, the frequency varies. So what is character and how does it matter for leadership?
Well, character is, I think, one of the more fascinating words in the American language because we use it in so many different ways. We use it to describe temperament. We tend to also use it to describe how someone behaves in a specific role, that there are certain character expectations for certain jobs that you might have. And then we also sort of in a shorthand way, think of it as just morality. And there's really much more to that. So one of the things I did in my book is talk through these different meanings and talk about how and why they are important at different moments in time. And I really arrived at a definition of character that says that it is a publicly ascribed reputation that is a privately contrived sort of one that also represents your temperament. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think the best way to think about it in our world today is we call something akin to this a brand. What is someone's brand, right? And their brand is the reputation that they'd like to be known for. It's also something innate to whatever the product or the corporation, the cause is. And then it's also essentially a strategy, right? You want your brand to connote certain things about you. And so you engage in specific behaviors. And I think this is where it's really interesting. When you look back to sort of the Greeks or you look to Plutarch, what you see is that character is essentially, action being manifested. So in other words, what you do is really who you are, and who you are essentially infuses all that you do. So this is where I think it's fascinating to me, because character has an aspect where it is performative. It is about performing in the role that you're in. It's also about being something that is authentic to you, because people do have to feel that you are at least sincere in those actions. And then it is also the way you hope other people see you while you're doing all of those things. So it is this fascinating mix of temperament and acting and reputation. And really, at the end of the day, your actions speak more than whatever words you can say about who you are.
You also explore authenticity as a factor in the success of a president or the failure of a president. And you mentioned it as you were describing character. Tell me, how do you apply the lens of authenticity to how you look at presidential success or failure?
Well, this actually goes to kind of the history of character. So on the one hand, when we understood character at an earlier age, what we understood is that you were kind of born with a base character. And really, your life's work was about trying to improve your character. In fact, you would be working on your character, trying to become a better person, trying to learn more about how to treat others and how to behave, or learn about your job, so that then you would become good, right, at what you did and at who you were. And if you sort of developed your character to a point where it then became a part of your nature, we tended to describe that as, oh, that's someone's second nature, right? Well, over time, what we decided is that we don't like this idea of a second nature. We don't like this idea that somebody might be sort of putting on airs or pretending to be someone that they weren't. And in fact, in the 1960s and 70s, part of the movement about bringing sort of people to their authentic selves was really what became all the rage. So this idea that you shouldn't try to be anyone other than who you are, you should just always be yourself, meant that we came to start accepting people kind of in warts and all, right? And they became, I would argue, almost overly authentic, to the place where now we would rather have someone who was authentically awful than in fact somebody who might be trying to be better than themselves, but not fully sincere. And I think this is part of the problem that we have with our contemporary presidents, is that we have decided that we'd rather see them in all of their flaws all of the time, because at least we could trust their flaws and that they weren't lying to us, than we would see them as people who maybe would be kind of donning a performance to try to meet the moment or act in some role that we felt was insincere or inauthentic.
Maybe we can unpack that with some specific examples. You know, you argue that LBJ and Nixon were the ultimate political insiders, and that following Vietnam and Watergate, the American people became disillusioned with politics and started gravitating towards outsiders for president. Can you tell us how did this evolution of preference for presidential outsiders evolve? How is it shaping, how is it beneficial for presidential behavior, and how is it problematic?
So it is interesting because in the past, what we usually wanted was someone who had a tremendous amount of experience in politics to prove themselves at lower level offices and to eventually work their way up to the presidency. I mean, even when we talk about people like Abraham Lincoln, people have this image that he was this huge outsider. The reality is he had spent his entire life in politics or law. He had, run for the state legislature as a very young person in the state of Illinois. He had served in the House of Representatives. And so while he hadn't served in many offices, he had been deeply engaged in sort of party politics and really the overarching ideas behind politics with respect to being an attorney. So when he then becomes engaged in sort of, running for office, people know him, they know who he is, they have a sense of what his character is about. I think what is the problem is when you look at both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, both of them had spent their entire lives in politics. Both of them had spent many years in Washington, and both of them lied to the American people about what was happening around them while they were in the office of the presidency. So Lyndon Johnson was not upfront with the American people around Vietnam. Richard Nixon obviously engaged in all of the scandals that we now call Watergate, but it was a lot of corrupt behavior. And all of that made Americans say, are you kidding? If this is who politicians are, if they are always so two-faced and they're lying to us, then my gosh, all of Washington, of course, must be a swamp and everybody there must be corrupt. So what we need are people from the outside to help clean up the mess that is Washington. And we started to reach for governors, right? Our first governor is Jimmy Carter, but obviously that goes to Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and then George W. Bush. Then what is fascinating about the governor problem is that somehow we aren't too happy with what these governors have necessarily given us. So then we decide, well, geez, maybe governors aren't even it. Maybe we need people with almost no political experience, right? And the truth of the matter is Barack Obama had very little experience in politics. He served in the state legislature in Illinois. And when he was there, there was literally only a 1-2 year period when he was there that his party was in the majority. He had very little power. And then he ran for the US Senate and became senator and almost immediately turned around and started running for president. So he was, I can understand why people say, oh, he's a lot like Abraham Lincoln, but actually when you dig into their backgrounds, that's not necessarily the case. And then, of course, when people were dissatisfied with that presidency, they say, maybe what we need is in fact no experience whatsoever. So how about business experience, right? And this is where we saw everyone from Ross Perot to Steve Forbes, and then eventually Donald Trump, winning the presidency. And this is about this idea that somehow politics doesn't require some level of knowledge or expertise about how Washington works to actually make it work. Like I tend to sort of laugh about this, but it is true. Politics is the one profession where people think that the best experience is no experience. And I think that is highly problematic if you actually expect or want our government to work favorably and effectively and efficiently.
In your chapter on Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, you call them the popular two-termers. You note that Reagan was glorified for unifying his party and leading it out of the political wilderness after Watergate, and that Clinton was dismissed by his party despite resurrecting its relevancy after losing 3 successive presidential elections in the 1980s. Increasingly, we seem to be moving from the middle, as they operated in, to the edge in politics. I'm interested in your thoughts on how bipartisanship or lack thereof factors into presidential success.
Yeah, so this issue kind of speaks to a different book that I co-edited with a few colleagues that's called The Presidential Leadership Dilemma. And I sort of looked at some of the same themes in Amateur Hour. But really what this was about was that when you win the presidency, you run and you win on behalf of your party. You become your party's leader, you become the party nominee, you become that spokesperson. And really since the McGovern-Fraser reforms of the early 1970s, that process has become, I would argue, increasingly based on presidents winning with ideological movements behind them. And the problem is, okay, so if you win by your party, well, then once you get there, you are in fact president for the entire country. And you are asked to be a national leader as opposed to being a party leader. And I think one of the problems is for those presidents recently that haven't had much political experience is that they really end up kind of leaning on their parties. They lean on their ideological movements. They lean on kind of who brought them to the dance rather than understanding what the new job is or the new role is once they get to the presidency, which is to in fact lead for the whole nation. And this is why I think, when you look at George W. Bush, or you look at Barack Obama, or you look at Donald Trump, those 3 presidents, even if you like them, you tended to like them at the beginning and you liked them at the end. In other words, the people who sort of looked at these presidents at some level, they didn't really attract more people to their coalition. They tended to just stay with their base. And I think that is in some ways one of the downfalls of each one of their presidencies, is that they remained in this party's leadership role and they never saw themselves kind of as the nation's leader.
And remind us of some of the ways in which Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, as I described it, reached into the middle and sort of grabbed the policy issue that was probably associated with the other party and moved it forward. Maybe you could just give us a couple examples.
Sure. I mean, look, we can look at Ronald Reagan's presidency and we can say, hey, he actually did some tax increases. That would probably never happen today in a Republican world. He also, did an immigration reform proposal. I don't know that that would happen in today's world. And then, of course, when you look at Bill Clinton, he was interested in the welfare reform proposals. He looked at ways to bring together a balanced budget, which was something that was more interesting to the Republicans than to some of the Democrats. And I think what is important about this is that both of those presidents understood that if they were broadly popular, okay, by the time of their reelection, then their party was going to have to back them. And there really wasn't going to be an opportunity for somebody on the sort of flank or the wings of their party to run against them in the primary. Because really, you know, you only get primary challenges if you are an unpopular incumbent, right? So Jimmy Carter obviously had a primary challenge from Ted Kennedy. Gerald Ford was very notably challenged by Ronald Reagan in '76. And then you see George H.W. Bush challenged by Pat Buchanan in 1992. So those primary challenges come out of a party being dissatisfied with the leadership and with the sort of state of the presidency at that moment of reelection. And this is where I think a good president says, I don't really need to worry about my party. I need to worry about the rest of the country. And if I can keep my approval rating above 50 or right around 50, I won't have a primary challenge and I'll probably win reelection.
And you just described how both Reagan and Clinton followed that path, but that neither George W. Bush or Barack Obama did. And the idea of just the perpetual campaign mode, how do we look at that versus the act of governing? How do we move people beyond perpetual campaign mode to say, okay, I am elected for 4 years. I am the president of the United States. How do we move this nation forward in a way that can bring people together?
Well, this is where I think the lack of political experience shows, right? What, you know, both George W. Bush and Barack Obama were incredibly skilled at, and really, truthfully, Donald Trump was campaigning, right? These men loved to be on the stump. They loved to be at the big rallies. They loved to kind of have the call and response, if you will, with the people who supported them and were their followers. They weren't very good at negotiating or compromising or in some way finding creative solutions. And this is what I mean about authenticity, right? So Ronald Reagan was an actor and Bill Clinton was a politician, like through and through. And the truth of the matter is both of them understood that there were times that they had to perform a role, even if it didn't sort of fit with who they were or what they liked. They knew that there were times to kind of step into leadership or make agreements with others that were going to be beneficial in the long run, even if it was sort of not true to them, right? And I just think we have become so enamored by the idea of celebrity that we accept celebrities for being who they are, right? The Kardashians never have to be anybody but who they are. Let me tell you, when you go back and you look at like Elizabeth Taylor, she was an actor through and through, right? She acted every role. She was who she needed to be. And this is where I just think we've confused what it actually means to be a leader. It doesn't just mean that your force of personality is everything that everybody should bow to.
You know, so what you're really saying is part of the challenge that has led us to the state we're in is we as the electorate over prioritizing authenticity.
Yes.
As opposed to a leader being who she or he needs to be. I think you talked about a couple of C's as a different examples as to the way that they would act. Maybe we could talk about that just a little bit.
Sure. So I really believe that there are essentially three main strategies of leadership. One I call courage, the other one I call compassion, and the third I call curiosity. I tend to think of them like the Wizard of Oz, right? It's the scarecrow, the cowardly lion, and the Tin Man. And if you think about what this means, what it is about is it's about how you approach a situation. So you're in a leadership position, the situation comes to you, and you basically have a choice. Do I approach this kind of with strength and with force and maybe take a risk and be decisive? That all falls within courage, right? Or do I approach this situation from a place of curiosity, meaning I actually take a step back and I talk about, the fact that maybe it's important to form a commission, that maybe it's important to bring in some more experts to talk about ways to manage or do things. In other words, I sort of delay the action by looking to have more questions and more answers. And I hope that through this process, we will kind of, as a collective, arrive at a solution. And then there's really a third way. And that third way is compassion. And that means that sometimes it's not appropriate to ask questions. Sometimes it's not appropriate to take action. Sometimes it's just appropriate to kind of open your heart and try to empathize and sympathize with others who are telling you that they have needs or there are things that are not being addressed. I think when I think about that a lot, I think about the moment actually where George Washington was facing a conspiracy. There was a moment where all of the officers were ready to essentially mutiny under his leadership. They had not been paid. The Continental Congress had not come up with money to pay the officers. And George Washington, who was sort of famously known, right, for being this very tough, strong, silent type. I always think of him as, if Clint Eastwood had lived in the 1780s, he would have been George Washington, because that's kind of the character that George Washington always affected, was this like make my day kind of strong, silent type. Well, he walks into this meeting with all of these officers and he kind of very publicly and very notably, right, pulls out his speech and he goes to start reading his speech and he can't read it. And so then he pulls out his glasses. And it is known that he then basically said to the officers, forgive me, essentially in this fight, I have essentially lost my eyesight along with everything else that I have given up. And supposedly officers began weeping. So he took this moment that could have been very contentious, and had he approached it kind of head on with a confrontational strategy, he might have had a mutiny on his hands. But he instead kind of revealed his vulnerability. He talked about, his eyesight, his failing eyesight and his failing health. And yet his heart is still in, this fight for independence. And it was that it turned the moment to where they said, of course, we must again follow his leadership. So this is where I think, George Washington, I don't know if he was sincere. I don't know if that was, an improvisational moment. I can't read his mind, but what I can read is that he did it and that leadership strategy was successful. And certainly everybody in the room believed that it was sincere, but he could have just been acting and that would have been fine, because what was important was the result, that we didn't have a mutiny and his leadership remained intact.
And your point is that you're tying authenticity and character together, that if there's three different things you need to have as your full suite of actions that you could do as a leader, even if they're not authentic to you, to really have the right response to the right issue, that you need to be open to that broader suite of responses, even those that may not come naturally to you.
Yes. I mean, look, one thing I will say, President Kennedy, is that you know me. I have actually worked for you in the past. I am not somebody who is a patient person. I try very hard. It is something I work at every day to be more patient. But I have to be honest, when problems come my way, there are moments where I'm just so frustrated. I have to like take myself into another room to try to calm down because I want to come to a solution more quickly. And so, compassion is actually a trait that I actively work on. I mean, I will tell everyone and anyone who knows me, it is something that every day I look to become a more compassionate person because it's just not my sort of nature. But I'm hopeful that one day it will become a second nature. And I'm hopeful that that will always help me be a better leader.
Indeed, and I'm sure it will. We have a couple of questions from the audience. From a CU Boulder faculty member, what role should or does public opinion play in US presidential decision-making? When should presidents make unpopular decisions in particular, which some would call true leadership?
So I think that's really interesting because this is the question of like what does it mean for it to be unpopular, right? And I think this is where the question is unpopular for whom, right? So one of the things that I think about is, you can look back in 1995, President Clinton was faced with the idea of should he give Mexico a loan because the Mexican currency was failing, or should he not? And when in fact, they polled it, it was not popular at all. It was incredibly unpopular. And it was so unpopular that even though Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole, who were then majority leader and speaker of the House, really actually believed that the US government should give this loan to Mexico, they said we can never pass anything through Congress because it is so unpopular right now. And Clinton said, well, this is not going to work. I mean, here's the problem, right? If the Mexican currency fails and then all of these people try to come into the United States, Americans are going to be livid. And at that point in time, he went over to Bob Rubin, who was then Treasury Secretary, and said, what can we do to actually give Mexico this loan? Because Gingrich and Dole tell me we can't get it through Congress. So he went out kind of on a limb to do something that was unpopular. And in fact, Mexico not only got the loan, but they ended up repaying the loan before it was even due. They repaid it with interest. The Treasury even made money on it. Most of the American people were somewhat kind of, I would say, unaware of that because it was kind of a background series of maneuvers, right? But then you have to look at something like Obamacare, right? Which was very unpopular at the outset. It was pushed through in a very partisan way, and it remained partisan and it remained unpopular. In fact, until the Republicans tried to essentially get rid of it during President Trump's administration. And that Obamacare was one of the things that actually did hurt Obama's legacy and sort of opinion among Republicans in sort of his tenure. So, I mean, this is where I think you're right. I'm not saying that I think any of these decisions are easy because I think that this is the difficulty of being a president. But I do think that there are ways to also think about things. I know that when you look at President Barack Obama's first year in office, the falling out with the Republicans actually happened over the stimulus bill. And that was all passed in February of 2009. And then essentially the relationships became toxic and Obamacare then just kind of became a casualty to that. One of the things Bill Clinton said years ago was he said, if I could have done it over, he said, I probably would have tried welfare reform before I tried healthcare, just because sometimes it might be better to start from the center and then move to essentially the more partisan issues than try to go the other way around. And I do think that some of what caused George W. Bush's immediate unpopularity after the 2004 election, where he was reelected, was in fact, his whole party said, let's go, let's privatize Social Security. And a whole bunch of Democrats and people said, what are you talking about? You just won because you were the war president and you said Kerry wasn't going to be able to be a good war president. What are you talking about? Privatize Social Security? I had no idea you were going to touch my Social Security. But that was something that was very important to the Republican base. So I do think all of these decisions are difficult ones, but I would argue that, this is where I think Biden has actually been pretty good at this. He is more often than not giving Republicans a chance to come to the middle. And he's saying, I'll work with you. Come on board. And then he's saying, but if you don't come on board with some reasonable time frame or reasonable policy objective, then we are going to move forward. And I think it's about that balancing. It's about not the hard tacking one way or another, and really thinking about what's needed at any one moment.
We have another question from the audience. Can we only assess presidential character with the benefit of history? That is,
No.
in the moment, we can't know whether a president is making the right decisions, and we need to benefit from time to judge. And if this is accurate, how can citizens make informed decisions about whether to re-elect presidents?
So I believe this deeply, that a person's character doesn't change. Like I said, their leadership strategies may evolve and they may become better, but who they are doesn't really change. And I think that this is where it's also so informative when you have a public official who's running for the presidency to be able to look at how they behaved in their previous offices, because what you'll be able to see is kind of what leadership strategies they leaned on, who their character was ahead of time. I mean, I kind of joke that, to a certain extent, the White House and the presidency is a little bit like the institution of marriage, right? If you essentially date someone and you believe that they're going to change once you get married, you're probably going to have a rude awakening. And I tend to think the same thing about politicians when it comes to the White House. If you think a politician is going to evolve once they get to the presidency, I just think that's a faulty reasoning. The likelihood is they're going to be more of who they are, not less of who they are. And so what I would say about this is that I do think that character matters. And I do think you should try to understand who these people are before they actually get there. And to me, this makes me a little bit controversial in the world of political science, because in some ways I'm more interested in who they are as a person and how they make decisions than I am in their policy platforms or their sort of campaign promises. Because to me, what I know is that every president basically ends up with a whole set of issues that they did not bargain for or anticipate being on their desk. And so they almost never have the presidency they imagine they're going to have, or the presidency that they build a campaign platform around. So I actually think you're better off kind of looking at the person as opposed to sort of their party and their platform, because I think their context is going to determine more of their policies than in fact their wish list and party platform.
Well, where do you see presidential character coming from? Does it come from experience? Does it come from upbringing? Is it personality? Can it be cultivated later in life? Where do you see it coming from?
Well, so first we have to be honest. All presidents and all presidential candidates are inordinately ambitious. Okay, these people are people who believe that they have what it takes to govern the country and be the country's representative on the world stage. Okay, that takes a lot of ambition and a lot of ego. So, I don't think that there's anything wrong about that. And I don't think that our presidents have changed. What has changed is that ambition has become more overt or more explicit. When you look back at people like Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, they used to talk about the burdens of the office. They used to talk about how they were so dutiful and they were sacrificing so much to give to the office. But everyone who knew them, there's a great quote where, John Adams said, I think it was John Adams, it might've been Hamilton, who said that Thomas Jefferson was as ambitious as Oliver Cromwell, right? Everyone knew Jefferson was ambitious. He wasn't some gentleman farmer. The difference is that these people, I think, had much more kind of, I would say, societal constraint around how they could behave. So first of all, it's important to understand all presidents are crazily ambitious. The other thing that's important to understand is that all presidents are kind of wildly opportunistic. And by that, I mean that they are able to perceive opportunities in the political environment and turn them to their advantage. So even someone, right, like President Donald Trump, when Scalia passed away, he was the first presidential aspirant to say, look at my list of judges. Here's who I'm going to actually nominate. That was like an innovation in terms of campaigning. And it also was incredibly opportunistic on his part because it brought the evangelicals over to his side when he said, these are the conservative judges that the Federalist Society loves and that evangelicals want to be on the Supreme Court. So, this sense of opportunism is also there. I think that, again, the biggest difference between the past and the present is not just this sort of societal or cultural constraint around expectations, but there is also this lack of experience also means something. So when I talk about this, I usually explain that, Abraham Lincoln violated the Constitution in a number of different ways, right? He suspended habeas corpus. He moved to essentially assemble troops after the firing on Fort Sumter without congressional authority, and that was scandalous back then. But it's also true that Abraham Lincoln loved the Constitution, was an attorney, had spent his entire life around politics. And so what does he do? Well, July 4th of 1861, right? And it's no coincidence that it's July 4th, our Independence Day. He submits, to Congress an entire sort of document saying, please make right my wrongs. I need you to sanction what I did in terms of assembling troops to defend against the Southern secession. Please make right these wrongs. Congress needs to approve this. So he, even as he was violating the Constitution, he looked then for ways to repair and really amend things so that it wouldn't be irreparable harm. And I think that the problem of our current presidents who kind of don't have that grounding or experience, they don't understand what norms can be violated and which ones should not. All of that becomes, I just think, really a fraught problem. So when we have more self-obsessed ambition and we have kind of more inexperienced and I would argue self-serving opportunism, we end up with kind of this ungrounded and unmoored presidency that really needs norms and expectations to operate well.
Is there evidence that voters select presidents with strong character, that voters recognize character through debates and life stories?
So what voters want is usually the character that they didn't have in the last president. So we're in this kind of boomerang world with character. And the way I tend to think about it is like, right, okay, so we tended to think that George H.W. Bush kind of didn't have a lot of energy, and he was sort of passe, right, of this other generation, right? So there's Bill Clinton, you know, Mr. Fleetwood Mac, all this energy, baby boomer, here we go, isn't this great? Then of course, Bill Clinton has all of his personal failings around Monica Lewinsky. And then that meant that he had sort of no sense of morality or boundaries. Like he was too flexible for his own good with regard to policy, and he was too opportunistic with regard to his own personal whims, right? Giving Mark Rich a pardon and the like. So then, right, we elect George W. Bush, who is a born-again Christian, who already went through as a baby boomer his sort of downfall of alcoholism and, you know, wild times. And then he kind of saw the light, and now he's a more moral character, right? But then what we're upset with George W. Bush about is that he really couldn't be a war president because he had spent all of his time kind of on domestic issues as a governor and didn't really have a sense of foreign policy. And he essentially abdicated that whole world to Dick Cheney. And the country was not pleased with that. And then, of course, what do we want? You know, because George W. Bush is also not a very good orator. He's not very good at speaking. So then, of course, we're completely enamored as a country with Barack Obama, who is one of the most eloquent, you know, presidents that we have had really since Kennedy. I mean, he could, you know, write these beautiful speeches and inspire, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. To this day, when he sort of talks, I think people still listen, right? Because there is such an enjoyment to hearing him speak. But then the problem with Barack Obama, according to sort of the American people, is that they felt like he was too much of a law professor. He didn't act enough. He wasn't decisive enough. He took months to figure out what we were going to do with Afghanistan. We still never pulled anyone out of Guantanamo Bay. There were all of these ways in which kind of some of the actions didn't seem to match with the rhetoric. So we can think about Assad, right, crossing the red line, and Putin taking over Crimea. All of these things were kind of actions where people were wondering if there shouldn't have been more force. So then, of course, what do we end up with? Well, Donald Trump, who is force personified. That's all he is. In fact, I don't think he has any other mode than brute force and risk. And then, of course, after 5 years of that, we're, you know, and by 5 years, I mean the entire year of him campaigning before, we're exhausted by that. So then what do we want? Now we want compassion. We want some sense of somebody who's just going to be heartfelt and hear us and isn't going to kind of be in our face all the time. So there's Joe Biden. But what's going to be the downfall with Joe Biden? Well, it's probably going to be that he's kind of too weak and sleepy, as Trump described him to begin with. So who knows what we'll want after Biden. But I certainly see us as just being a country of reaction rather than sort of discerning appropriately what may be needed at what time.
And as we're discerning, is character in the eye of the beholder? That is, one person's example of strong character can be another person's example of a character flaw. Is saying a president has strong character just another way of saying we agree with her or him?
You know, I hope not. I mean, I like to think that we can understand sort of character in a way that that really does animate both a person's brand, right? And a person's kind of reputation, and then also kind of who they hope to be, right? So what I mean by this is I would like to think that even if we can't agree on whether we like McDonald's, Jack in the Box, or Burger King better, we can all have a conversation about those different fast food chains and their relative strengths and, you know, defects, and what kind of we each think about them, and that there are some commonalities in which we can kind of arrive at. Because I do think that some of what character is a societal reputational understanding about that person. I mean, I think there are very few people who would say, you know, that sort of people liked George W. Bush. I mean, most people liked him. You know, you looked at all of his sort of Pew Research profiles, they liked him. They liked who he was. But they didn't necessarily think he was all that intelligent, and they didn't necessarily think he was good at essentially managing things. So I like to think that we could objectively, or at least relatively unbiasedly, have these conversations.
So this is a question from a CU Boulder student that I think gets at the core of what your book is about. He or she first asked, some say President Trump was extremely authentic, and that this was part of his appeal to many voters, and asked, do you agree? But the follow question is, what are we to do if voters prefer a candidate who is less skilled but authentic to an inauthentic but skilled opponent?
Well, this does get to the heart of my book. And what I basically say is that we're probably going to end up being dissatisfied with the leadership that we have, because someone who is always just who they are not going to be able to meet the leadership demands in every moment. And this is where actually, to be a good leader, you need to be more than who you are. I don't think you can just be your total self. I mean, this is where I think it's always so funny, because, you know, we have this phrase, right? Too much information. I mean, at some level, at what point does authenticity become too much information? I mean, there's some things I don't want to know, you know, and I really want somebody who can actually lead in the moment, even if it's not something that is comfortable to them or natural to them. And I agree with you that we culturally have this problem where we seem to be kind of okay with, like I said, this whoever is authentic all the time is the person we like the most. I mean, I think we can see this, you know, with a variety of different people who are even now coming to the fore and talking about leading. You know, whether, I mean, and I always go back to kind of actors and celebrities. It's stunning to me how many celebrities believe they would be good political leaders only because they have the name recognition that goes with their fame. And I just am not sure that that's true. I mean, you know, in California, we saw Arnold Schwarzenegger do an okay job for a while, but not a great job. You know, Minnesota saw Jesse Ventura kind of try to maneuver that. And there's a reason why Tim Pawlenty was elected afterward. And in California, Jerry Brown was. So I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, but I do believe that we will be dissatisfied with leadership so long as we believe it is only about marketing.
Now, your amateur hour suggests that more experienced insider politicians will make better presidents. As some have said, politics is for the politicians. What is learned through political experience that allows insiders to perform better?
So I think what's learned is actually that you lose as often as you win. So politics is really about a game where you are working to advance your interests, but there are a whole bunch of other people who are working to advance theirs too. And what is learned over time is, I would argue, how to sort of win a little bit more, right? So you get 70% instead of, right, maybe being on the losing side of 40 when you're negotiating things. And you start understanding where the pressure points are, when it is time to sort of walk from a deal or not. You know, there's a very, very stupid movie that has a very wonderful moment in it. And it's a movie called Havana. And it is with Raul Julia and Robert Redford. And Robert Redford is a gambler and Raul Julia is a politician. And they are literally playing a card game, and Raul Julia loses. And, you know, basically Robert Redford says, it's always great to play with a politician, because gamblers know that sometimes they have to lose with a winning hand in order to win with a losing hand, but politicians just want to win all the time. And so because of that, you know, I think, you know, politicians who've had time in the system, who've taken as many knocks as they have had wins, kind of know what's successful. And it gives them a better sense of strategy and opportunity and timing, and they know who to pressure and when. I mean, I think about it like, you know, I don't know, is Tom Brady a better quarterback now than he was when he first stepped in, you know, to the role? I'd argue he's pretty amazing now. There's a reason why he's gotten 7, you know, Super Bowls, and he's still going.
John F. Kennedy said, it's only after you lose that the mysteries of politics become clear.
Yes.
So affirming what you just said. Now we're up against our time here, so this will be our last question, or you can just wrap up. You mentioned intelligence. How critical is it for presidents to be intelligent? How can they be successful if they're not very intelligent? Can intelligence get in the way of them succeeding? And if you could just wrap up with this answer, that would be great.
So I think actually there's a big difference between being savvy and being intelligent. And I think presidents need a little bit of both. And what I mean by this is they need a little bit of street smarts, right? They need to have a feel for the system and a feel for other people. And sometimes that is called kind of emotional intelligence. Sometimes that's just kind of common sense street smarts. And then where I think they actually need to be smart is they need to be smart about themselves. And this is where I think our politicians also kind of run aground and fail. Most politicians are not very good at being self-reflective. Most of them are a little bit scared to look at their own failings. And so there is some way in which kind of their ego kind of carries them through a lot. But the truth of the matter is, our greatest politicians, like I said, when I look at Washington, when I look at Lincoln, these were people who never stopped asking themselves, how might I be better? And they were ruthless with respect to their own introspection. So I'm not saying that every politician has to do, you know, some deep, you know, psychoanalysis or therapy, but I do think they have to have kind of enough reflective self-awareness to know what is happening in the moment and how they are behaving, and then how to modulate who they are in that moment.
Well, thank you for those comments. Thanks for all your comments. Thanks to everybody for joining us today, and a special thanks to Dr. Brown for sharing your time with us. The Conference on World Affairs relies on the generosity of people like you to make this event possible. Please consider making a gift to the Conference on World Affairs, which can be done www.colorado.edu/CWA. Thanks again for tuning in. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. Just a real pleasure to be here.